"You need to remove that boy before I call the cops," she said, already dialing. My son sat there in his wheelchair, holding a paper boat he had made, tears forming in his eyes. That was the exact moment I knew this woman had no idea who she was talking to. It started like any other peaceful Sunday morning. Birds were chirping, the sunlight was pouring through the curtains of our farmhouse kitchen, and the scent of bacon and coffee filled the air. My son Nathan was already dressed and ready before I could even finish pouring my cup of coffee. He had that determined little smile, the kind that always made me feel like everything was going to be okay, no matter what the world threw at us. Nathan was born with cerebral palsy, and though his legs didn't work the way most kids did, his spirit more than made up for it. That morning, like many others, he was excited to ride his motorized wheelchair along the gravel path near the woods and watch ducks waddle around the pond that bordered our land and the edge of the HOA neighborhood. Now, technically, the walking trail that curved behind a few HOA homes wasn't HOA property. It was public county land that just happened to run alongside the community's back fence. We had moved here just 6 months ago, looking for a quieter life after I retired from field service and settled into the sheriff's office full-time. I chose this area because I thought it would be calm, a good environment for Nathan, and far from the city noise. I thought wrong. At the heart of this false peace was one woman who treated her title as HOA president like she was some kind of dictator. Her name was Karen Langley, and her reputation had already reached our ears before we unpacked the last moving box. People said she could smell unapproved paint colors from 3 blocks away, and that she once fined a neighbor for planting daisies instead of hydrangeas. Nathan had passed by her house before, but had never interacted with her. He always kept to the path, never touched anything, and never disturbed anyone. That morning, he had brought with him a tiny paper boat he had folded at breakfast, determined to float it in the pond. It was a small thing, innocent, but to him, it was a great adventure. "Be back in 40 minutes, Dad," he called with a wave. I waved him off, not knowing those words would lead to the storm that was about to hit. Less than 15 minutes later, my radio buzzed. I was sipping coffee on the porch, just starting to relax. The dispatcher's voice crackled with urgency. "Sheriff Dawson, we've got a call about a possible trespasser near Brookside Pond. Caller reports a suspicious male loitering near backyards." My heart skipped. There was only one person out that way, Nathan. I was in my cruiser before the coffee cup even hit the railing. The drive was short. As I rounded the bend near the trail, I saw them before they saw me. Nathan's wheelchair sat still on the path, his paper boat bobbing gently in the pond, and standing in front of him, phone still to her ear, was Karen Langley herself. Her arms were crossed, lips pursed, posture stiff with self-importance. Nathan looked shaken, unsure of what he'd done wrong. That was when I heard her words, cold and sharp. "You need to remove that boy before I call the cops," she said to no one in particular, but with her phone in her hand like it was a loaded weapon. I parked, stepped out slowly, and watched her freeze as she turned and saw me in uniform. Her face went from smug to confused to pale in less than a second. I took a deep breath and walked over, keeping my tone even. "Man, did you just place a call about my son?" She blinked. "Your son," she said, voice trailing into uncertainty. Nathan turned his chair slightly, clearly relieved to see me. I looked her straight in the eye. "I'm Sheriff Dawson. The boy you threatened to report is my son, and we live right there," I said, pointing toward our farmhouse which was visible through the trees. She tried to recover quickly. "Well, I didn't know he was your child. He was near our property. We've had problems with strangers lately. The HOA has strict guidelines about." I held up my hand. "That land he's on. County land, not HOA. He's done nothing wrong." She scoffed, clearly not used to being corrected. "Look, I didn't mean any harm, but other residents have complained." I narrowed my eyes. "Really? Because I've received no reports, and if someone had a concern, the right course would be to speak to me, not intimidate a child, not post fake reports." Karen straightened her blouse, suddenly realizing the situation was slipping from her control. Maybe if he didn't roll through here every day like he owns the place. "He rolls through here because he likes the ducks," I interrupted. He's never stepped foot on your property, and if you harass him again, we'll have a much more serious discussion." Her mouth opened like she wanted to argue, but she said nothing. Nathan looked up at me, his voice quiet. "Did I do something wrong?" That question broke me a little inside. "No, buddy," I said, "you didn't. Some people just forget what kindness looks like." Karen stood silently as I helped Nathan pick up his paper boat and guided his chair back toward the path home. I could feel her watching us, but for once, she had nothing to say. She had no idea what she had just started. Back at home, I tucked Nathan in for a nap and replayed the scene in my mind. Karen had crossed a line. It wasn't just about HOA power anymore. It was about my son's dignity, safety, and right to be a kid. I dealt with criminals, liars, even violent people in my line of work, but something about this entitled woman's smugness, her willingness to make a child feel like a threat, got under my skin more than anything I had dealt with in years. And that's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to file a report, not yet. I wasn't going to confront her again. Instead, I was going to watch, wait, and gather, because something told me this wasn't the last time Karen Langley would overstep her bounds. And next time, I'd be ready with proof, witnesses, and the full weight of the law. Later that evening, I sat on the porch watching the sun set behind the hills, trying to quiet the storm in my head. Nathan was asleep, finally calm after a long day, but my thoughts wouldn't settle. That woman had threatened my son, not with fists or weapons, but with the kind of cruel power that thrives behind rules and fake authority, and she had done it with a smile. I had worn the badge for 15 years and dealt with all sorts of people, but there was something especially dangerous about someone like Karen Langley. She believed the HOA made her untouchable. What she didn't know was that I had already begun to dig. The next morning, I stopped by the county record's office on my way to work. It took less than 20 minutes to get a detailed property map of the area, including the trail, pond, and surrounding fencing lines. I made sure to request the most recent topographical records to show exactly where public land ended and where private property began. The trail Karen was so determined to gatekeep wasn't just public access. It was clearly part of a green belt set aside for county use. She had absolutely no legal claim to it. But I knew facts alone wouldn't stop someone like her. People like Karen didn't operate on truth. They operated on control. Still, I made a few copies and tucked one in my glove compartment. I had a feeling I would need it soon. Later that afternoon, I received an envelope shoved in the mailbox just outside our property line. Inside was a letter from the HOA board with an official-looking seal. It was a formal warning addressed to me about my son's presence near HOA homes, claiming his unauthorized activity had caused several residents to feel unsafe. They cited a non-existent HOA bylaw and demanded he stay off private trails. It was laughable and infuriating at the same time. What made it worse was the smug little note scribbled in the margin. "I hope this clears things up. Regards, Kay." That woman had the audacity to harass my son and follow it up with a smiley face signature. She was pushing, testing limits, and she wanted a reaction. I didn't give her one. Instead, I walked over to the barn, opened the old file cabinet I kept locked in the back, and pulled out a folder marked Community Enforcement Cases. Over the years, I had handled several complaints involving neighborhood disputes, and I had always made a habit of documenting HOA-related conflicts that crossed legal boundaries. It was time to create a new file. I labeled it Langley Incident and started dropping in everything: copies of the letter, screenshots of the call logged from dispatch, and the map I had picked up earlier. Then I called an old contact at the county civil office to verify the HOA's authority limits. Within the hour, I had written confirmation that the trail was outside the HOA's legal domain. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. 3 days passed with no sign of Karen. Nathan resumed his walks, a little more hesitant than before, but I reassured him that he had every right to enjoy the trail. I made sure to stay nearby, doing chores within sight of the path, just in case. On the 4th day, Karen struck again. A video appeared on the local neighborhood app, posted by a user named KLangley_OA. The video showed Nathan near the pond, his wheelchair parked by the water, with the caption reading, "Suspicious boy loitering again. Watch your kids." The post had been up for 2 hours before I saw it. By then, there were several comments, some shocked, some disgusted, and a few defending Nathan. But the damage was done. She had tried to paint my son as a threat, to stir up fear and get the community on her side. This time, I saved everything. Screenshots, comment threads, even the metadata from the video. I also contacted the administrator of the app and requested they preserve the post for record. The admin, a quiet guy named Ben, who had no idea who Nathan was, agreed once I identified myself and explained that the video could be part of a harassment case. He sounded uncomfortable but cooperative. Later that day, Nathan came home quieter than usual. I asked him if anything had happened, and he hesitated before telling me that a group of kids riding bikes had asked him why he was always spying and creeping around. My stomach dropped. The post had worked. Karen had planted the idea, and it was already spreading like poison. That night, I drove to the edge of the trail and walked along the fence line. I stopped at the spot where Nathan liked to watch the ducks and scanned the area. No signs, no fences, no markers, just open land, trees, and calm water. I returned the next day and installed a discrete motion-activated trail cam in the brush facing the walking path. I added another near the old tree stump where Nathan often parked. Then I left them alone. If Karen or anyone else wanted to stir up trouble again, I'd have eyes on it. I didn't just want to prove her wrong. I wanted her to expose herself. 2 days later, I got a call from Ms. Dolores, one of the oldest residents in the HOA and someone Karen had never been able to push around. Dolores was sharp, plain-spoken, and not easily fooled. She told me she had seen Karen outside that morning, pacing near the pond, taking more photos. Dolores had confronted her, asking why she was harassing a child. Karen reportedly replied that the sheriff's son doesn't get a free pass just because he's disabled. Dolores was disgusted. She told me she didn't believe any of what Karen was trying to spin, and that if I ever needed someone to speak at a meeting, she'd be there with bells on. I thanked her and wrote down every word. That evening, the trail cam caught someone walking by slowly. It wasn't Karen this time. It was a boy, maybe 16, stopping near the stump and bending down. He appeared to mess with something before hurrying off. When I checked Nathan's wheelchair later that night, I noticed a bolt on the frame looked slightly loosened. Nothing had failed yet, but it was tampered with. My jaw clenched. This was escalating. It was one thing for Karen to stir drama with her mouth and keyboard, but now someone was putting my son in real danger. Whether it was her idea or someone acting on her behalf, I was done waiting. I spent the next hour compiling footage and notes, cross-referencing times and dates. Then I picked up my phone and called the county ADA coordinator and a lawyer friend who had helped in a past civil harassment case. If Karen wanted to push things further, she was about to find out just how badly she had underestimated me, not just as a father, not just as the sheriff, but as someone who didn't lose battles, especially not when his son was on the line. Nathan was excited that morning, more than usual. He had a new sketch pad in his lap and said he wanted to draw the ducks by the pond. He called it his quiet mission, and I smiled watching him roll out onto the gravel path with the usual clunk and whir of his chair. I watched him from the porch until he disappeared into the trees. The sun was warm, the air calm, and for a moment, I let myself believe that maybe things would finally settle down. I made coffee, fed the chickens, and was halfway through cleaning out the barn when my phone buzzed. It was a number I recognized from the local clinic. My stomach dropped before I even answered. The nurse on the line explained Nathan had taken a fall, nothing life-threatening, but he had a cut on his arm, bruises on his legs, and was shaken. A jogger had found him by the pond, lying beside his tipped-over wheelchair. They had helped him up and brought him to the road where an ambulance had picked him up. I didn't even hang up before I was running to my truck. The drive felt longer than it was. My thoughts were spinning, trying to piece together how this could have happened. Nathan was careful. He didn't speed. He never leaned forward too far. His chair was sturdy, built for trails. When I arrived at the clinic and saw him lying there with his head turned to the wall, quiet and pale, I felt a familiar rage building up in my chest. Nathan looked at me and tried to smile. I sat beside him and asked him gently what had happened. He said the wheel locked mid-turn, like something got stuck or snapped. Then he said something that made me freeze. He thought he had heard someone laughing from the trees. I didn't ask anything else. I just told him he was safe now. When we got home, I rolled his chair into the garage and started checking every bolt, wire, and gear. That's when I found it. One of the small screws on the main wheel hub had been halfway unscrewed. Not from use. Someone had tampered with it. It wasn't a loose connection. It had been twisted just enough to cause failure after a few turns. Someone had tried to hurt my son. I went straight to the trail cam footage from that morning. At 7:42 a.m., the camera by the stump caught a figure moving through the trees. It was the same teenager from earlier footage, Karen's grandson. He was wearing a hoodie, baseball cap pulled low, but the posture and build were unmistakable. He paused near the stump, crouched, then moved directly toward the spot where Nathan's wheelchair usually passed. I slowed the footage frame by frame. At 7:47, he bent near the base of the trail, reached toward the dirt, then turned and ran. 10 minutes later, Nathan had his accident. My blood boiled, but I stayed calm. Instead of confronting him or Karen, I copied the footage, labeled it, and added it to the file. I called my lawyer friend again. This was no longer a matter of community conflict. This was criminal. Tampering with medical equipment, especially a mobility device, was a felony in our county. It was time to escalate. But I wanted more than charges. I wanted to make sure every lie, every smear, every sneaky tactic Karen had used came to light. That meant being patient, just a little longer. The next morning, I went into town to speak with Dolores. She lived 2 houses down from Karen and always had a sharp eye on the neighborhood. I told her gently about the fall without blaming anyone directly and asked if she had seen anything strange that morning. She thought for a moment, then told me she had seen Karen's grandson leaving her backyard early, wearing a hoodie and walking quickly. I asked her if she'd be willing to share that on record if needed. She didn't hesitate. That's the kind of neighbor she was, honest, no nonsense. Later that week, Nathan was resting in the living room, and I was reviewing more security footage when another video popped up on the community app. This time, it was a grainy clip of Nathan near the trail again, with a caption reading, "Why is this child back again after we warned him?" The comments under it ranged from confused to cruel. Someone even wrote, "Maybe the sheriff thinks he's above the rules." My jaw clenched. Karen was building a narrative, one that painted Nathan as a problem and me as an enabler. I knew her type. People like Karen believed if they repeated a lie often enough, it would become truth. I noticed something interesting in the footage metadata. The video had been recorded on a camera mounted near Karen's back fence. That wasn't unusual, but what caught my attention was the angle. It was from an old utility pole that bordered county property. That pole did not belong to the HOA. Installing surveillance equipment on it was illegal. That gave me another opening. I drove out to the county office again and filed a report about unauthorized surveillance equipment on public property. I submitted images, coordinates, and screenshots of the video angle. I knew it would take a few days to process, but it was one more piece tightening the net around her. Nathan asked me that evening if he should stop going to the trail. I looked at him and said, "No, not a chance. If we start backing down now, people like her win." He nodded slowly, trying to be brave, though I could see the hesitation in his eyes. That night, I sat outside under the stars and replayed the last few days in my head. Karen had crossed the line from annoyance into danger. Her actions were no longer just offensive. They were malicious. She had weaponized fear, turned her grandson into a pawn, and made my son the target of her delusions. But now I had the evidence. I had a witness. I had motive, and I had the law on my side. I wrote out a timeline, detailed every incident, organized photos, printed maps, and prepared formal complaints for both the sheriff's office and the district attorney. I wasn't going to let Karen slink away behind HOA bylaws and Facebook posts. I was going to hold her accountable in a way that left no room for excuses. And if she thought this was the end of it, she was about to find out what it really meant to trespass on the wrong side of the law. The following week began with a series of small but calculated moves. Karen had been quieter lately, but I knew better than to assume she was done. People like her didn't stop when exposed. They regrouped. Sure enough, by Tuesday morning, flyers appeared on neighborhood doors claiming a proposal was being made to install a new fence around the HOA trail. The paper was printed in color, complete with a map that conveniently stretched the boundaries of HOA control beyond legal limits. At the bottom, it called for a community vote and stated that non-residents would be banned from entering any area behind the HOA homes, including the pond access. Nathan showed me the flyer when he came back from a stroll. He asked me if we were going to move. That question stung more than I expected. I told him no. This was our land, our home, and nobody was running us out. I headed straight to the HOA clubhouse later that afternoon. The meeting had already begun when I walked in. Karen stood at the front of the room holding a laser pointer and was midway through explaining how the proposed fencing would protect the children and property owners. She spotted me, and her smile faltered for a split second before returning to its usual plastic shape. The room was full, a mix of concerned residents and those just there for gossip. I stood quietly in the back, listening. Her speech was polished, but her facts were all over the place. She claimed rising trespassing, increased complaints, and vague safety issues that no one could verify. Not once did she mention Nathan by name, but her references were crystal clear. When she asked if anyone had concerns, I raised my hand. A few heads turned, and the room fell into a curious hush. I introduced myself calmly as Jack Dawson, resident of the adjacent property, county sheriff, and father of the boy referenced in all her fear-mongering. Karen's jaw tightened. I stepped forward, holding up the county map. I explained in clear terms that the land in question was not HOA property, never had been, and any attempt to fence it would be considered illegal construction on public land. I showed printed copies of the topographic survey and pointed out the county right-of-way easement that ran between the pond and the HOA's fences. I emphasized that this green belt was maintained by county tax funds and was free for public use. Karen tried to interrupt, waving a binder filled with what she claimed were resident complaints, but the room wasn't with her anymore. I wasn't yelling. I wasn't threatening. I was presenting calm, undeniable truth. Several neighbors began murmuring to each other. One man stood and asked why they hadn't been told about the legal status of the land before now. Another woman said her kids liked playing by the pond and had never felt unsafe. Karen looked flustered. She tried to steer the conversation back to property values and community image, but it was clear the tide had turned. Then Dolores stood up from the second row and cleared her throat. Everyone went silent. She told the room she had lived in that neighborhood longer than most of them had been alive, and that Nathan was a polite, gentle boy who had never once caused trouble. She turned to Karen and asked her flat out why she was so obsessed with pushing one child off land that didn't belong to her. Karen's mouth opened and closed like she wanted to shout, but no sound came out. The HOA vice president, a nervous man named Hal, quickly stepped in and suggested tabling the vote on the fencing until further review. The motion passed, and the meeting ended abruptly. As people filtered out, some stopped to thank me. A few apologized for staying quiet for so long. One young mother said she hadn't known the full story and felt terrible for thinking Nathan might be a threat. Karen avoided my eyes the entire time, gathering her papers in silence and exiting through the side door like a storm cloud slipping away behind the hills. That night, I checked the trail cam again. It had been quiet for days. No strange activity, no tampering, no late-night visitors. For the first time in weeks, it felt like maybe things were beginning to settle. But then, just before midnight, my phone pinged. It was an alert from one of the new motion detectors I had placed near the trail. I pulled up the feed. Someone was walking near the pond with a flashlight. I zoomed in. Karen. Alone. I watched her scan the ground near the stump and then stare toward the camera, as if sensing it. She didn't do anything illegal, not that night, but her presence told me she wasn't finished. The next day, I filed an official report with the county sheriff's office for harassment and tampering with disability equipment. I submitted all my documentation, including video evidence, statements from witnesses, and screenshots from social media. It wasn't just about the incident with the wheelchair anymore. It was about an ongoing pattern of intimidation, defamation, and abuse of authority under the disguise of HOA leadership. I also forwarded the report to the ADA office. Cases involving harassment against disabled individuals were taken seriously, and I wanted every angle covered. A week later, I received a call from the county commissioner. He had seen the complaint and was requesting a formal inspection of the HOA's operations. Apparently, mine wasn't the first concern about Karen's leadership, but it was the most well-documented. The commissioner mentioned there had been recent whispers about misuse of HOA funds and complaints from other residents. Now, with a public harassment case brewing, he said it might be time for a deeper look into how that community was being managed. By the end of that week, word had spread. HOA residents received letters about the upcoming audit. Some were confused, others relieved. Karen, however, was furious. She posted a long message on the neighborhood app accusing unnamed residents of betrayal and claiming the HOA was under attack. She called it a witch hunt, but the more she ranted, the more people questioned her leadership. It was no longer just about Nathan or the trail. It was about control. People were waking up to how much of it she had taken without consent. On Saturday morning, I took Nathan back out to the pond. We brought bread for the ducks and sat quietly in the shade. A few families passed by and waved. One man even handed Nathan a small gift bag with new sketch pencils. As the sun rose higher, I looked across the still water and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks: calm. For the first time, it felt like the neighborhood wasn't just tolerating us but accepting us. Karen's house, visible from the far side of the trail, sat quiet and closed. No activity, no barking orders, just silence. And in that silence, I knew we were far from finished, because silence from someone like her was never the end. It was the calm before her next move. But this time, I was ready. This time, she was the one being watched. The peace didn't last long. Just when things seemed to be cooling off, Karen made her boldest move yet. It started with a sudden spike in activity around the HOA clubhouse. Trucks pulled in with building materials, and within a day, workers began digging along the trail's edge. Wooden posts were laid out in neat stacks, and it became clear a fence was being erected right along the pond's public access path. I watched from the porch with a knot in my chest as they began marking boundaries that didn't belong to them. The construction crew was from out of town, likely hired quickly and with vague instructions. I knew immediately this was Karen's doing. She hadn't waited for another vote, hadn't filed permits, and certainly hadn't informed the county. She was trying to build a wall through public land like it was hers to divide. I walked down to the site that afternoon and asked to see the permit. The foreman looked confused. He said he was just told to build according to the instructions given by the HOA president. When I asked if he had checked the property lines, he said that wasn't his job. I didn't argue with him. I took photos, documented everything, and returned home to call the county zoning board. They were not pleased. Within hours, an official work stoppage order was issued. A representative from the county showed up the next morning with documents in hand and ordered the crew to halt all construction immediately. Karen arrived shortly after, furious and red-faced, demanding explanations and trying to argue her interpretation of the land ownership. But this time she wasn't just speaking to neighbors. She was speaking to government officials who had no patience for self-made rules and community politics. The zoning officer calmly explained that the land in question was clearly marked as public access and that any construction on it without approval was not only a violation but subject to fines. Karen tried to spin the situation, saying it was for safety and community improvement. She even had the nerve to suggest that Nathan's presence was a concern that forced her hand. That statement was a mistake. The zoning officer raised an eyebrow and asked her to clarify. Karen stumbled through her words, realizing she had said too much. I stayed silent during the exchange. I didn't need to intervene. She was burying herself. As the officer wrapped up the site inspection, Karen was handed a written notice that included possible citations for unauthorized construction, environmental impact violation, and misuse of HOA funds if the project had been paid from the association's budget. That last point seemed to hit her the hardest. Her face went pale. If it was proven that HOA money was used for something illegal, she could be held personally responsible. Later that day, I called the district attorney's office to check on the harassment complaint. They had reviewed the file and found grounds to proceed with charges against Karen's grandson for tampering with Nathan's wheelchair. Karen herself would be subject to further investigation, especially if it could be proven that she had encouraged or influenced the boy's actions. I submitted the newest information about the fence and the statement she made about Nathan being a concern. Every detail added weight to the case. Every paper trail led back to her decisions. Meanwhile, the HOA board began to fracture. Hal, the vice president, called me and asked if we could meet privately. We sat outside the local diner, sipping coffee while he nervously explained that several board members were beginning to regret supporting Karen. They had trusted her leadership for years, but were starting to see how deep her control ran. He told me that some financial documents had gone missing, and others didn't add up. Karen had been signing off on expenses without proper approval, and some receipts included payments to companies that didn't exist or had no clear connection to HOA business. Hal handed me a copy of a suspicious invoice for landscaping that had never been done. It was for several $1,000s and dated the same week Karen had posted her first video targeting Nathan. The implication was clear. She had used HOA money for personal efforts to control the area near her home, all while launching a smear campaign against my son. I advised Hall to bring the information to the audit committee and to protect himself by providing copies to the county commissioner. He agreed and thanked me for being patient when most people would have retaliated weeks ago. Karen must have felt the pressure mounting because she started showing up at community events again, trying to smile and shake hands like nothing had happened. But the charm was gone. Parents whispered behind her back. Retirees gave her cold stares. Even her usual allies on the board kept their distance. She was unraveling, and she knew it. That weekend, another letter appeared in the mailboxes of every resident. This one was from the HOA's interim legal advisor, informing everyone of the pending audit results and promising transparency. It also mentioned that pending charges against a family member of a board member had prompted a temporary suspension of that board member's duties. Karen wasn't named, but everyone knew. Nathan asked me if he could still go to the pond. I nodded. I wanted him to live freely, not fearfully. So the next morning we went together. He sat with his sketchbook while I stood nearby, watching the trail, the water, the empty space where a fence almost existed. For a while there was silence, peaceful, undisturbed. Then from the far end of the trail, a small group of kids approached. I tensed, unsure of what would happen. But then something amazing unfolded. One of the boys called out Nathan's name and asked if he could see what he was drawing. Nathan hesitated, then nodded. The kids sat beside him, asking questions about the ducks, his chair, his art. He laughed. He actually laughed. The first real one in weeks. I didn't interrupt. I let the moment happen. From a distance, I could see the beginnings of something I had hoped for all along. Acceptance. Understanding. Not everyone in that neighborhood had been poisoned by Karen's fear tactics. Some just needed the truth to be visible. And now it was. Karen's silence wasn't from defeat, not yet. It was the sound of a predator cornered, calculating. But the difference now was that she was being watched from every angle, and I had everything I needed to finish what she started. Not with vengeance, but with justice. The kind that didn't just punish but corrected. The kind that restored what she tried to destroy. 2 weeks after the work stoppage order, the county audit began. Officials visited the HOA office unannounced, escorted by 2 deputies who served as neutral observers. Karen wasn't there when they arrived, which raised eyebrows immediately. The board president missing on the day of an official audit didn't sit well with anyone, especially since several financial records had already gone missing. Hal, who had by then stepped up as the acting president, greeted the officials and handed over every file he had been able to gather. Most of it was incomplete. Several entries were blacked out or contained numbers that didn't make sense. One check for $3,000 was labeled Trail Beautification, but had no invoice attached. Another expense showed a landscaping service paid monthly for a plot of land that didn't exist. Every inconsistency was noted, and every single one pointed back to Karen. At the same time, the district attorney's office informed me that charges against Karen's grandson had officially been filed. He would face juvenile court for tampering with medical equipment, and depending on the testimony and evidence, Karen herself could be charged as an accessory if it was proven she directed or encouraged his actions. Dolores, who had become one of Nathan's loudest supporters, agreed to testify about Karen's statements and behavior. She said it wasn't about revenge. It was about accountability, and she was tired of watching good people suffer while bullies hid behind fake rules. Nathan was doing better. His spirit was slowly recovering. He had started drawing again every morning, sometimes sketching the pond, sometimes just the trees, but his shoulders no longer looked heavy. One evening, he showed me a drawing he made of a duck wearing a little police hat. I laughed harder than I had in months. He said the duck's name was Deputy Quackers, and that he was going to keep the pond safe. That silly moment reminded me why I was fighting so hard, not just to shut Karen down, but to make sure no one like her ever had that kind of power again. Power to scare, humiliate, isolate. The audit's preliminary findings were released quietly through official channels. They confirmed what we already suspected. Over $17,000 had been misallocated in the last year alone. Several payments went to vendors that were either unlicensed or non-existent, and worst of all, HOA funds were used to install illegal surveillance near the pond and hire a private investigator to gather information on residents who had disagreed with Karen. It was shocking and at the same time perfectly in character for someone who believed control was a right, not a responsibility. With the audit results public, a formal emergency vote was called. The neighborhood gathered under the clubhouse awning on a cloudy Saturday morning. Over 50 residents showed up, more than any previous meeting. Karen did show up, wearing dark glasses and speaking in her usual clipped tone, trying to spin everything as a misunderstanding. She blamed bookkeeping errors, claimed the surveillance was for neighborhood safety, and denied ever saying anything hateful about Nathan. But the room was no longer on her side. One by one, residents stood and shared stories. A woman said Karen fined her for hosting a birthday party without approval. An older man said he'd been told to repaint his fence 3 times because Karen didn't like the color. And then Dolores stood and gave a quiet, powerful statement about the way Karen had singled out a disabled child and tried to convince an entire community he was dangerous. When the vote came, it wasn't even close. Karen was officially removed from the board, barred from holding any future leadership role, and issued a no-contact order regarding Nathan and my family. Her home was still hers, but her reach had finally been cut off. She left the meeting in silence, surrounded by the stares of the very people she used to command. No one followed her. No one defended her. It was over. In the weeks that followed, change rippled through the neighborhood. New signs were placed at the trail's entrance, welcoming everyone, including families from nearby homes like mine. A small wooden bench was installed near the pond, donated by neighbors in honor of Nathan's courage. Someone painted the back of it with ducks and trees and a little badge that said Pond Patrol. Nathan beamed when he saw it. He asked if we could sit there every Sunday. I told him we could sit there every day. Karen tried one last time to file a civil complaint, claiming harassment and defamation. It was dismissed almost immediately due to lack of evidence and a mounting pile of documented actions against her. She eventually sold her home and moved to another neighborhood. Rumors said she tried to join their HOA and was immediately denied. The damage she had done to her own name was permanent. Nathan's story reached beyond our county. A local news station picked it up, airing a short segment about how one boy and his father stood up to an entire HOA. They interviewed Dolores, showed Nathan's drawings, and included footage of the new bench. When they asked Nathan what he would say to people going through something similar, he looked at the camera and said quietly that kindness isn't weakness and that even small voices deserve to be heard. I stood off to the side while he spoke, proud in a way that no words could touch. One quiet afternoon, I took Nathan for a ride in the patrol vehicle. It wasn't a formal ride along, just father and son rolling down back roads, talking about ducks, robots, and why clouds look like marshmallows. We passed the trail, now calm, peaceful, and lined with wildflowers that had bloomed since spring arrived. Nathan looked out the window and said it finally felt like home again. I told him that was because he made it that way. No law, no badge, no board vote could fix what he had fixed just by being brave. As the sun dipped low and turned the fields golden, I realized something else. Karen's reign might have started this battle, but it was Nathan's resilience that ended it. Not with anger, not with fear, but with quiet strength. And as a sheriff, I had never seen justice delivered in a more powerful way. The summer came in slowly, with warm evenings and quiet mornings. The neighborhood had begun to settle into a rhythm that felt different than before, more relaxed, more neighborly. It was subtle at first, a few more smiles when passing by on the trail. Children laughing near the pond without looking over their shoulders. No more strange glances at Nathan. No more whispered complaints or tension lingering in the air. It felt like a heavy curtain had been pulled away, letting in sunlight that had long been blocked by control and fear. Nathan had started to open up more, too. He talked more freely, invited other kids to draw with him, and even offered to teach a younger boy how to fold a proper paper boat, the same kind of boat he had held the day Karen first called the cops on him. There was a new HOA board in place now, and while I never had any intention of joining it, I agreed to attend their first meeting as a guest speaker. The board members were young, diverse, and eager to restore trust among residents. They asked me to speak not as the sheriff, but as a parent who had been on the receiving end of a system gone wrong. I didn't prepare a speech. I just stood there in front of the group, looking at faces that had once been silent witnesses, and told them what it felt like to watch your child be turned into a problem for someone else's convenience. I told them what it meant when power is left unchecked, when rules become weapons, and when kindness is mistaken for weakness. There was no anger in my voice, just truth. The room was silent when I finished, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the sound of people listening. In the weeks that followed, Nathan was honored at a small county ceremony. The local disability advocacy group presented him with a certificate of courage. They said he had shown the entire community what it meant to stand tall even when sitting down. Nathan looked up at the crowd, then back at me, and for once, he didn't look nervous. He said, "Thank you," then added that he hoped other kids who felt small would remember they mattered. The room clapped, but I couldn't move. I just watched him, remembering every tear, every question, every day he came home asking if he had done something wrong. Now here he was, teaching others what right looked like. The pond trail had never been busier. Families brought picnic baskets. Seniors took long walks. Teenagers practiced photography near the water. One day, someone installed a small wooden library box beside the pond bench. Inside were books for all ages, including a few children's stories Nathan had loved. He donated one of his sketchbooks, too. It had his name inside the cover and a message written in his own handwriting. "If you feel lonely, draw something. It helps." That little notebook filled up quickly. Kids drew ducks, boats, frogs, trees. A few drew wheelchairs with wings. I sat on the bench one morning, flipping through the pages, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. Not just relief, real peace. Karen's name hadn't been spoken in weeks. Her house had a for sale sign that stayed up longer than expected. Nobody wanted to be associated with the history that had settled over that roof. Eventually, it sold to a quiet couple with no interest in HOA leadership. They kept to themselves, planted sunflowers in the yard, and never once mentioned fences or rules. It was as if the land itself had taken a deep breath and decided to start fresh. I never saw Karen again, though I heard rumors she had moved to another town and tried to join a new board. They didn't take her. Her reputation had spread further than she thought. I did not celebrate her downfall. I simply accepted it as the natural conclusion of a path she refused to turn from. One evening, Nathan asked me if bad people ever really go away. I told him, not always. Sometimes they just lose their power. Sometimes they stay angry and bitter in their own little world. but that doesn't mean they can hurt you anymore." He nodded slowly and asked if that meant we had won. I thought about that for a moment. Winning to me had never been about defeating someone else. It was about protecting what mattered. It was about keeping dignity intact, showing strength without cruelty, and proving that the truth would always find its way to the surface. I told Nathan yes, we had won, and more importantly, we had not lost ourselves in the process. The following weekend, the community held a neighborhood gathering at the trailhead. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few tables, a grill, lemonade, and people finally talking to each other again. Nathan was the guest of honor. They gave him a little sheriff's badge made of wood and a framed copy of his duck sketch, blown up and laminated so it could hang at the clubhouse. He beamed as they cheered. I stood back, watching him surrounded by kids who had once avoided him, and felt something settle deep inside me. The past was not forgotten. It didn't need to be. It just no longer had power over us. The sun began to set, casting long golden light across the trail. Nathan rolled up beside me and asked if we could stay a little longer. I told him we could stay as long as he liked. He looked out at the pond and pointed to a small duck waddling along the edge. "That one's the new deputy," he said. I looked over and chuckled. We sat there quietly, listening to the sounds of laughter, ducks, and breeze through the trees. The same place that had once been the center of conflict had become something else entirely, a place of healing, a place of truth. As we drove home later, Nathan asked if we could make paper boats again. I said, "Of course." He said this time he'd teach me how to fold one that never sinks. I smiled and told him I would be honored to learn, and in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the start of something stronger, not just for Nathan or me, but for an entire neighborhood that had finally remembered how to be human.